Hi guys, welcome to Barker's History. This is the first video in a year-long video series that you will watch that will cover American history. We'll go all the way from the early 1700s and the ideas of the Enlightenment and equal government and protections under the law, all the way, hopefully at least, to the 1970s and 80s and get all the way maybe even to modern day. And so from here on out, you're going to use this video series to really help you get better as a student and understand history, and I hope you make the most of this. And so for our first video, we need to talk about where do the ideas of our government actually come from. And we can trace those origins back to an event that happened in Europe in the 17th and 18th century called the Enlightenment. And if you were with me for 7th grade, you've already been exposed to the idea of the Enlightenment, of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and Baron de Montesquieu, so some of this will be a bit of a review for you. And so you need to title your notes The Enlightenment, Objective 1.1, and that's important to do that because this is going to keep your notes in nice and steady order for you. Now, in case you weren't with me in 7th grade, or you've completely forgotten everything that the Enlightenment was about, let's kind of have a real quick rehash of what it is. It's a movement of ideas that happened in the 17th and 18th century in Europe, and it piggybacked off of a lot of ideas that had been going around for centuries. If you remember, the Enlightenment uses science and mathematics and reason to try to understand the world around it, and they had borrowed a lot of ideas from, say, the influence of algebra in the Arab world, and the ideas of Confucius and some of the religious beliefs that had taken place in China and throughout Asia. And so people begin to try to understand the world around them. They want to understand why is the grass green? Not just because God made it that way, but because of the way our eyes interpret the light that reflects back off of the pigment of and all these different things. So they're wanting to use reason to try to understand the world around them. And many people are going to take that idea of scientific enlightenment and adopt it to politics. And so we'll talk about a few of those guys again as kind of a review for it. But these people are there to help kind of influence government and make it more make government more fair and equal for everyone. One of those philosophers is a guy by the name of John Locke. And we've talked about Locke in the past. He's a philosopher, and he really applies that scientific reason to government ideas. He comes up with the idea of what is known as natural rights, the idea that every person is guaranteed the rights of life, liberty, and property. No one is allowed to take your life. That is illegal. No one is allowed to squash your liberty, and that everyone should be endowed with the ability to own property. Now, Locke also brings us something known as the social contract theory, and he bases a little of this off of Hobbes's ideas, but the idea, he says, is that the government is allowed to be in charge because the people essentially put them there. So every time you vote, for instance, you are giving the government the permission to make laws and rules for you. And if that government does not do what they're supposed to do, if they don't, for instance, protect your natural rights, you have every right to rebel, and that government should be disbanded. And so, in essence, every time you vote, every time you put a leader in power, they're signing a contract. And that contract is an agreement that they will protect those essential things of life, liberty, and property. Now, when the American Revolution comes around and guys like Thomas Jefferson are writing the Declaration of Independence, they're reading the ideas of Locke in particular. They really like this idea of the social contract. And so for them, they're going to argue that because they don't have representation in Parliament, that they haven't actually signed that contract. And so therefore, they should be allowed to be independent of themselves because they don't feel as though that the king is looking after their natural rights. They're going to use this as a justification for revolution. And Jefferson, when he writes the Declaration, he even uses very similar language to Locke. He changes it slightly, but says that all men are guaranteed the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, dropping the property and saying life under the king is so bad that we should have this revolution, we should have this independence because you have made us so miserable and unhappy. Now, one of the other Enlightenment philosophers that we need to talk about is a guy by the name of Baron de Montesquieu. And Montesquieu, his big ideas, his big contribution to the Enlightenment is the ideas of what is known as checks and balances. And it's this idea that our government should be divided up into separate but equal parts. So for instance, under an absolute monarchy, the king is in charge and the king makes all the power. But for instance, in a constitutional monarchy, there's checks and balances there. The parliament is there to make rules in conjunction with the king. Now, that's really important because when the colonists when the patriots are going to eventually separate and form their own country and form the United States, we're going to adopt this idea of checks and balances. And as a result today, we have three governing bodies in our country. We have the legislative branch, which makes up Congress. They make the laws. With the executive branch, that's the president. They enforce the laws. And the judicial branch is the ones who interpret the laws. They make sure that that's the Supreme Court. They make sure that those laws are fair, and they make sure that they're equal for everyone, and no one group has more power than the other. And the idea of checks and balances is that all three of these branches are supposed to look after each other to prevent one group from becoming more powerful than another. The final philosopher that we're going to talk about is a guy by the name of Adam Smith. And we have introduced Adam Smith before in his ideas of laissez-faire. Laissez-faire, remember, is the idea that government should be hands-off. It should stay out of the way when it comes to economic matters. Let the private sector run the economy. Remember, think of it like hands-off. Go be lazy government. Go be a lazy government, laissez-faire. This is important in American history because the United States will adopt a laissez-faire style of economy all the way up through you can argue, through the 1940s, when the Great Depression happens and the New Deal ushers in kind of the end of a laissez-faire economics. We'll talk much more about that down the road, so that's not something you need to focus on right now. But do understand that part of what the colonists are upset about is the idea of taxes being levied on them unfairly in their ideas. And they say the government should be out of the way. The king should have no right to be instituting taxes on them. And so when they develop their own government, they're actually going to develop a government that makes it really difficult for the government to collect taxes. And that will be a problem actually down the line. And so we've come to question time. And why is this so important, Mr. Barker? This is a section of the videos where we get to kind of look at everything we've learned so far and kind of understand why this is so important. And so we'll break it down into a couple of simple topics. One, John Locke. Why is he important to us? Well, his ideas set the framework for the rights of individuals. His ideas influenced the founders. I mean, Thomas Jefferson will basically not so much plagiarize, but will borrow so heavily from John Locke that it was almost Locke's word-for-word writing that make up the Declaration of Independence. Why is checks and balances so important? Well, because it sets up our entire system of government. If we don't have checks and balances, there could be the possibility of a tyrant who could take over. There are many countries and many examples around the world of people who come into power who are sole rulers, sole presidents, and they are tyrants, and they're able to do their will. And so the founders worried about having a leader becoming a tyrant. And so they loved the ideas of Montesquieu because it kept that government balanced. It made sure that they would never have a king. And there's a reason why the United States has been such a successful democracy. Democracies throughout history have fallen. The Greeks, the Romans, there have been countless times where other democracies after us have tried and failed. And the United States has lasted as long as it has, mainly because they've looked out after each other and they've taken care of one another and made sure that one person does not have too much power. And so that's it. You have finished your first video in this video series. This is 1.1, and this is actually part 1 of 1.1, the Enlightenment. Next video is 1.1 as well. It's the same objective, and you're going to learn about what's known as the Great Awakening, which also gives us a really important and influential piece of thought for the revolution and for setting up our entire government. You need to make sure you have all of this in your notes. On the left side of your Cornell notes, make sure that you have any important dates, facts, information, or VFL words that you think might be coming up. On the bottom, make sure you complete your summary as well. So you're kind of summarizing all these notes into 1 to 2 sentences. If you have any questions, please see me in class. Otherwise, have a fantastic rest of your day. You can go ahead and actually watch video 2 right now if you'd like to get it out of the way, or you can wait till later. But until next time, I will see you later. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye, everybody.